Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing a tag video. This is the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag, which was created by the Book Pusher last year, and it went around for a little while last year. And I looked at the tag, I saw that other people were doing the tag, I considered doing it, and I just never did it. And then recently I was chatting with someone in the comments section who asked me if I would do this tag, and I went back, looked at the tag again, and thought, you know what, maybe it is time for me to do this tag. So thank you, Amy. This is in no small part because of you. So the thing about this tag is that it was adapted originally from a blog tag that was a romance tag, a Get to Know the Romance Reader tag. And I think you can sort of tell in a couple of the questions that don't transfer quite as neatly onto fantasy as a genre as you might hope. This tag also daunted me in the past because there are some of these questions where honestly I think my answers are going to be very long-winded. I have a lot of ideas and possibly some of these subjects could or should be whole separate discussion videos. But anyways, the idea of sitting down and doing this whole tag has daunted me for quite a while. There are 10 questions, and the first of them is just like the most daunting thing in the whole tag for me. It is, what is your fantasy origin story? How did you come to read your first fantasy novel? And I'm gonna say that I do think this is one of those questions where it shows that this was originally a romance reader tag, because romance as a genre is a literary genre that we expect people to come to at a point in their life where they are either adults or perhaps teens, certainly old enough to have a strong memory of it. It's certainly a genre that I think you're expected to come to as a more fully formed person than how most of us, I think, experience fantasy for the first time. Because throughout the genre's history, fantasy is a type of storytelling that we frequently associate with children's media, and certainly not exclusively, at least at this point in history, where I think just about everyone is aware that there's like grimdark fantasy that's very adult. Adult fantasy has very much become part of the pop culture, the popular consciousness. But I think for the most part, the subset of fantasy readers for whom this question will make most sense is the subset of people who at some point as part of growing up were told or decided for themselves that it was time to put away the childish fancies and start consuming grown-up stuff that didn't have magic in it. And so then at some point these readers have to come back to fantasy as more fully formed human beings, consumers of media, readers, because they have realized that there is so much that this genre has to offer in terms of breadth and depth and literary merit, that there are so many different ideas, so many different types of thought happening in the fantasy genre. It's a really exciting genre right now, in case you were unaware. However, I am firmly not one of those readers. I am one of the other group of people, the group who never gave up that deep childhood connection and affinity for fantasy as a mode of storytelling. And I think the way I read fantasy as an adult, the way I read anything as an adult, is reflective of that. So what is my fantasy origin story? How did I come to read my first fantasy novel? The honest answer to this question is I have no clue. I have no clue what the first fantasy novel I read was. I am fairly sure that the first book I read on my own, the book that my parents used to literally teach me to read, was not a novel, obviously. It was a picture book. It was Go Dog Go by P.B. Eastman. And I ask of you, what genre is this, if this is not fantasy? the dogs are driving the cars. I don't know what to tell you. Do you like my hat? And certainly a huge percentage of children's picture books are fantasy in one way or another. At the same toddlerish age, though, that I was learning to read, my parents were also reading books aloud to me. I was not capable of reading a full novel on my own yet, but I was experiencing novels through that relationship of being read to. And certainly not all of these novels were fantasy, but there was a good deal of classic children's literature that falls under the fantasy umbrella that I had read to me at a very young age, some of which I have only the foggiest memories of because I never actually reread them once I got old enough to do that on my own. But some of them I have revisited in the interim. This would include Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. This would include The Wizard of Oz. Also The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, although I think I know for a fact that we didn't continue on with the Narnia series at that time. This would include A Wrinkle in Time, which is arguably also science fiction. Definitely the whole Borrowers series. I know the first book in this series is definitely most famous, but I know for a fact that we went through the entire series. The Phantom Tollbooth is one that I think I had read to me multiple times, and one that I never revisited after I was theoretically old enough to read it on my own. I have only the weirdest, fuzziest impressions of this book in my memory, and it's one that I actually do really want to reread. The first novels that my parents got me reading on my own were not fantasy at all. The first series that I got hooked on reading as a kid, like sneaking under the blankets with a flashlight at night, was the Nancy Drew books. Those are mystery, those are not fantasy. That was around first grade-ish that I started reading those as fast as I could possibly get my hands on them. And there were definitely other books I started reading then once I was capable of reading full-length novels that probably fell into the fantasy category, but I borrowed a lot of books. I got rid of a bunch of books that I owned from earlier in my childhood as I grew up. I don't necessarily know what all those books were. I definitely went through a phase in these early years of being obsessed with a bunch of books that I would loosely categorize as anthropomorphic animal fiction, which is considered to be a fantasy subgenre. Definitely in like the second to third grade age range, I went through a period of being deeply obsessed with Ursula K. Le Guin's Cat Wings series, which are very short books for very young readers. And this is hilarious because I know I got these from my school library, and at the time I had no idea who this author was. And it was an embarrassingly long time after I started becoming aware of Le Guin as an older reader before I realized that these books that I had been obsessed with in second grade were by Ursula K. Le Guin. But these are about a family of winged cats. Also in the anthropomorphic animal fiction category, I would put the Dimwood Forest series by Avi. Those were books I was really into around the same time. I also went through a period of reading just about anything I could get my hands on by Dick King-Smith, whose most famous book is probably Babe the Gallant Pig, the book on which the very famous movie is based. But that wasn't actually my favorite book of his growing up. I was deeply obsessed with both The Water Horse, which is like an origin story for the Loch Ness Monster, and Harry's Mad, which is a book about a boy who inherits an intelligent parrot, like with human levels of intelligence. And then I would say it was probably more around the 4th and 5th grade age range when I started reading the books that, looking back on it, are the books from which you can draw a pretty clear line from those books to my adult reading tastes, because that's when I think I started reading fairy tale retellings. Definitely some of the formative ones for me were Ella Enchanted. This was like my favorite book for years. I would also list The Prince of the Pond by Donna Jo Napoli in this list, and Beauty by Robin McKinley. And from there, the rest is history. I do want to point out, because this is interesting to me looking back on this history, I mentioned that I had parents who read me a lot of fantasy as a kid. That didn't necessarily extend to any original fairy tales. I know my mom had books of original fairy tales. I know she was aware of them, so I think it was probably a conscious decision at some point that those were not the versions of those stories that my parents wanted to introduce me to. I came to fairy tales, like many kids of my generation, through Disney movies, and also through picture book retellings that were, you know, picture book length, but not the original text from the Grimm's fairy tales or whatever the original source material was. They were retellings. And then, like I said, I eventually started finding these, you know, modern retellings for young readers that really excited me. There definitely was a period in late high school and throughout most of college where I wasn't reading much for fun because I felt that I was too busy. I couldn't let myself do that. And so I did have a sort of rough transition from YA to adult because there was a sort of chunk in the middle where I was reading very little. But in that period of time, I don't think I ever gave up on the notion that the stories I wanted to be reading were in a large part fantasy. So that was probably like an entire discussion video's worth of content on the first question. Let's see what the second one is. If you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be the author, and what's one trope you would insist be in the story? So this one is a simpler question. Thank goodness, this is easy. So I think the author I would choose would be Robin McKinley, because I have always identified very strongly with her protagonists. I think her protagonists think and behave in a way that feels very familiar to me. It feels personally like it makes sense, and that is why I identify with them. So Robin McKinley, and what trope do I want? My needs are simple. All I want is a magical costume change. 3, what is a fantasy you've read this year that you want more people to read? This is also pretty easy. I am going to recommend Storm Song by C.L. Polk, which is the sequel to Witchmark. It is the second book in the Kingston cycle, which is now a completed trilogy. I know that Witchmark got a decent amount of attention when it came out. I know I have friends who read it, and I'm pretty sure that none of them have picked up the sequel yet. I was very impressed with this sequel. These have a lot of magic, they have intrigue, they have murder mysteries, they have politics, and they have a queer romance in every novel. What more can you ask for? Witchmark even won the World Fantasy Award. Why is everyone sleeping on the sequel? 4, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what subgenre have you not read much from? I'm gonna give 2 favorite fantasy subgenres. Number 1, I'm gonna say fairy tale and folklore fantasy. Definitely. And number 2, fantasy of manners. And what subgenre have I not read much from? I have very strong preferences about fantasy subgenres, but I read pretty broadly within the genre. Part of that is something that has naturally happened since, 1, being on BookTube and being part of the book community online. You get a lot of social pressure, a lot of peer pressure to read popular books that maybe stretch you outside your comfort zone of what you would normally want to pick up. And 2, from deciding to become a yearly Worldcon member, nominating and voting in the Hugo Awards. That means I'm also paying a lot of attention to hyped new releases, and every time those awards happen, it pushes me to read books that I wouldn't otherwise pick up within both fantasy and science fiction. At any given time, I look at my most recently read books on Goodreads and I feel like it's always a snapshot that it involves way fewer of the books that I ostensibly think are my favorite types of books than I would hope. I think many of the books I will most love are sitting unread on my shelves for years because I keep picking up the new exciting award-nominated releases. That said, I will often choose to pass on a book if it's marketed as grimdark. I will also tend to avoid anything Lovecraftian, even if it's meant to be subverting the Lovecraft. I almost wanted to say like paranormal, urban, contemporary fantasy, except that there are actually a number of books I really like that technically fall within that subgenre category, so I don't actually want to say that. It is now nighttime because I can apparently never leave enough time to finish filming a video before the sun sets. No matter what time of year it is and when the sun is setting, this is my eternal struggle. At least I have decent nighttime lighting now. Question 5 is, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? I strongly prefer to discuss auto-read fantasy authors to auto-buy fantasy authors because I library a lot of newer releases. There are very, very few books I will pre-order or go out of my way to purchase as soon as they're available in stores. Also, I haven't been requesting things on NetGalley in the last couple years much at all, but certainly back when I was doing that a lot, I wouldn't necessarily buy a book immediately if I already had an e-arc of it. I was kind of temporarily buying a lot more new releases during the pandemic when the used bookstores were closed, and so were the libraries, and I was trying to support my local indie bookstores. But things are reverting back to normal again, and I'm sort of buying fewer new books again. So with that clarification out of the way, I have actually done 2 full videos on this subject on my channel before. I will link them for you. They are a little out of date though. The first was in 2017, and it was an auto-read authors topic for monthly recommendations that I did. I turned it into a sort of big discussion thing. And then the next year in 2018, there was an auto-buy authors topic for the BookTube SFF Babbles. And some of the authors I talked about in those videos I still sort of stand by, some of them I don't. But I talked in both of those videos about what I considered to be a key quality of an auto-read author, and that should be someone who could write something and publish something that was outside of my comfort zone, and I would still want to read it because I trust that author. And I have to say, while in theory I still support the ideas that I espoused in those videos, in a practical sense, my reading patterns have changed. In theory, I still totally support authors branching out, writing new things that are different from what their fans are already following them for. I think that's exciting, that's great, good for them. But I think since about 2019, I've been way more sensitive to the kinds of books I'm reading and the ways that they affect me. And I've grown much more comfortable just saying that it's okay that I don't want to read a book, no matter who the author is, how much I love them, how much other people love the book. I'm so much more comfortable now looking at any book that's about to be released and saying, you know, I'm gonna pass on this one. And that is me taking care of myself and not pressuring myself to read things that aren't gonna sit well with me. So, for example, in both of those videos, I talked about M Valente being an author who I would read a very different book from if she published one. Just for example. And now in 2021, I don't admire her writing any less than I did then, but she has two novellas either out or coming out in the second half of this year. The first is The Past is Red, and the second is Comfort Me with Apples. And I actively chose to include The Past is Red in my anticipated releases for the second half of the year, and I decided not to include Comfort Me with Apples because I took one look at the description of that book and how it was being advertised, and I said, you know, this one is one I can give a pass to. This one's not going to be for me. I also find it very hard to commit to being a completionist reader of any particular author if they already have an extensive backlist by the time I discover them, and or if they are a prolific writer, if they come out with a book every year, or like 2 books every year, because some authors do. For prolific authors, I will decide usually there is some subset of their work that I am interested in reading and some subset of their work that I am not interested in reading. So for me, I can think of 2 true auto-buy fantasy authors for me right now, because the requirements, and I'm dead serious, I am not joking, is 1, you must not be prolific, and 2, you must be unlikely to write something that is so far off the rails from what I expect given your previous work that I will decide to pass on it. And the 2 authors I am thinking of are Erin Morgenstern and Susanna Clarke. I was not kidding when I said must not be prolific. I actually have some thoughts on this because I've noticed that I am personally very attracted to the writing of a lot of authors who write slowly, who publish infrequently. There is something about art that comes from brains like this that I tend to jive with, and it's one of those intangible things that I don't think I will ever be able to put my finger on what it is or why. But I do suspect that if I were a writer, I would be this type of writer. So maybe it's something that I see in the way their brains work on paper that feels familiar to me. Maybe it's because the books they write feel more imaginative and unique to me and less beholden to the publishing trends of any given year. I don't know what it is. I don't think I will ever know what it is. But those are the 2 authors I'm naming, Susanna Clarke and Erin Morgenstern. I feel it is unlikely that either of them is going to come out and announce that their next book is going to be, say, a contemporary crime thriller with no speculative elements, or like a grimdark Lovecraft retelling. I think I am safe with them. Question number 6 is, how do you usually find fantasy recommendations? Goodreads, YouTube, podcasts, Instagram, ... etc., etc. This is another question that could be the basis of a whole discussion video. The sort of snarky answer is that recently I have tried to avoid getting inundated with recommendations from people, so I've sort of backed off on all of the sources of recommendations. Because let's face it, you're on bookish social media for long enough, you hear about so many books and it gets really overwhelming. You would think that the obvious answer would be BookTube, except I don't know if you've noticed, I've noticed because it's happening to me, is that the longer people are on BookTube as content creators, the less and less they keep watching other people's BookTube. It's a thing, I think. It's certainly a thing for me. The channels I still watch right now are almost exclusively people that I have like actual friendship relationships with. And they are the people that I get recommendations from, either by watching their videos or by having other discussions with them. Because I have a personal relationship with those people, not just like the parasocial relationship of following someone on BookTube. And that is something fortunate that I have as a member of this community, is I have friends here. So I guess the real answer is I get book recommendations from friends. And I'm saying book recommendations, even though this is supposed to be fantasy recommendations, because I am almost exclusively a fantasy and sci-fi reader, and I get my fantasy and sci-fi recommendations in the same places. I tend to follow people who also read both fantasy and science fiction. So I'm sort of generalizing book recommendations because it's kind of the same thing. I will say, aside from social media and other content creators, I have very different methods of, on my own, discovering backlist titles and older titles that I might be interested in reading on the one hand, and new and upcoming releases that I might be interested in reading on the other hand. Older and backlist titles I often discover just by browsing used bookstores, finding something that looks interesting and looking it up online, looking for reviews to see, is this something that someone I know has reviewed? Is this something that is recommended for fans of authors I like? And I do just sort of a lot of bumbling around random recommendation lists on the internet if I'm looking for something very specific. When it comes to new and upcoming releases, I follow genre SFF publishers on social media and authors whose work I've liked in the past, and I look out for book announcements. And I keep pretty close track of them because I do twice a year now anticipated SFF release videos. And I do those in part for me so I know what I'm excited about, but mostly for you, for the viewers, because I know I won't necessarily get around to reading many of those books. But I am going to share a link with you guys that's a Goodreads list that happens every year. I don't know who runs it, who sets it up every year, but it's the Can't Wait sci-fi fantasy of fill-in-the-blank year list that happens annually on Goodreads. Lists is one of the reasons I am still tied to Goodreads as a platform somewhat against my will. But these anticipated SFF lists every year are really good resources, and I can say that with confidence because, you know, anyone can add a book to these lists, and anyone can vote up a book that's already been added, and I add books to these lists every year, constantly. I mentioned that I follow publishers and authors on Twitter. If I see a book announcement that I'm excited about, as soon as it's on Goodreads, I will go and add it to this list. When it comes to actually making my video of anticipated releases, not everything that I've voted for on that list will necessarily make it into the video, depending on how many books I have for that 6-month time period. But this list is how I track things personally that I have heard of that have caught my attention. So that's sort of the process about how I learn about and track upcoming releases, and then I often just wait and see if any of my friends read them before I decide if I'm actually going to pick them up. Is that an answer? That's an answer. So that leads really nicely into question number 7. What is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? You can check out my anticipated releases video for the second half of 2021 that went up at the beginning of July. But then jumping ahead to 2022, one of my most anticipated books right now for the early months of 2022 is In the Serpent's Wake by Rachel Hartman. This is YA. It is the sequel to Tess of the Road. I have been waiting for news of this book ever since I read Tess of the Road. This is the sequel series to Seraphina and Shadowscale, which I actually have not read. I read Tess of the Road without reading the previous books when it was nominated for the Lodestar Award, and I loved it. It is a very introspective, character-driven fantasy novel, and there's incredible character growth over the arc of Tess of the Road. I am so looking forward to In the Serpent's Wake. This was the book where the working title of it that we had for the longest time was Tess of the Sea, and we finally got this final title and cover announcement not that long ago, like a couple weeks ago. I pre-ordered it like on the day the announcement happened. And I would really like to be able to get around to reading the earlier books set in this world, Seraphina and Shadowscale, by the time this comes out. Realistically though, I don't know if that's going to happen. This is coming out on February 1st from Random House Books for Young Readers. Question number 8. What's one misconception about fantasy that you would like to lay to rest? Here's a big one. There is this misconception that all fantasy is long series, and that it's therefore a huge commitment to get into reading fantasy. And like, this is really frustrating because it's obvious why the big series get so much hype, because they get hype again and again every time a new book releases, and the standalone only gets hype once. But there are so many excellent fantasy standalones. In fact, I am a huge standalone reader. I think the vast majority of what I read is actually standalones. I am not good at following through with reading sequels. I'm just not. And honestly, I promise you, it is not a problem with fantasy. There are standalones of every sort, every subgenre, I promise. Question number 9. This one is another doozy. This tag alternates between easy questions and total doozies. If someone had never read a fantasy before, okay, and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? So first of all, this hypothetical person, I do want to question them about what they mean by never read a fantasy before. I think this is another one of those things where this makes more sense as a romance genre question than as a fantasy genre question. I do genuinely think there are a lot of people who say, you know, really would like to read some good love stories but have never read a genre romance novel and don't know where to start. And that makes sense to me as a question for a tag. With fantasy, it is harder. Did you never read anything with magic in it as a kid? If not, I won't judge. I absolutely won't judge, but are you sure that nothing you've read as an adult is actually fantasy that was maybe masquerading in the literary fiction section of the store? Are you sure? But taking a sort of looser interpretation of the question, I'm thinking of a reader who maybe put away fantasy as a genre as they grew older, who is now very interested in embracing what is a thriving and exciting genre. What books would I recommend to this hypothetical person who I sort of assume isn't actually watching, because I assume anyone who is either already subscribed to my channel or is actively looking through YouTube for Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag videos is already a fantasy reader. Like, I sort of feel like anyone doing this tag is already preaching to a choir of the converted. But thinking of my hypothetical person who is a reader, but not of this genre, I'm going to make an assumption that this person is looking for adult titles. I think there's a tendency with this sort of question, with like intro to a genre recommendations, to recommend YA as sort of the easy reading gateway drug to the adult content, but I'm not sure that YA fantasy is really the thing that an adult reader who's reading other genres is going to want to convince them of what is really exciting, what the fantasy genre broadly has to offer. I'm going to recommend 2 books that I 100% consider to be fantasy novels through and through, that are published, at least in the US, by general fiction imprints as opposed to SFF imprints. And that's not the reason I'm picking them. I just think I happen to agree with these publishers that these are books with broad appeal. And then I'm going to recommend one that you will definitely find in the sci-fi fantasy aisle of the bookstore. So the first book I'm going to recommend is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a standalone. It is a Greek mythology retelling. The author here sort of fabricates an entire epic life story for this minor character from Greek myth. Circe is the witch who appears in the Odyssey and turns Odysseus's men into pigs. And this novel ties her story into a bunch of other myths as well. I would recommend this for anyone who is a little shy about getting into books with a lot of magic world building, because this has a lot of heightened fantasy elements. Many of the characters here are gods. It's got this rich, ancient, historical setting, but it is a setting and a mythology that, if you are familiar with classical Greek mythology, will already be familiar to you, so you're operating within a framework where you will recognize things. Although I might cautiously suggest, if you have in fact read the Odyssey or any other volume of classical Greek mythology, what genre did you think that was? I would suggest that it is possible that you have maybe already read a fantasy. Am I overthinking this? I think I'm overthinking this. The next book I'm going to recommend is sort of the polar opposite of that, and that's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I'm recommending this because I think if you're looking for something that will spark your excitement about fantasy as a genre and what kind of storytelling can be done within this genre, I think this could very effectively do that in a relatively short book. This book may seem a little dense at the start, but for me at least, it was actually a very quick and page-turning and engaging read. There's a lot of strangeness in this, a lot of mystery, but I think this is also a book that tackles one of the sort of big questions that is at the heart of a lot of fantasy, which is about the purpose, the meaning behind magic, which is sort of a stand-in for the unknown, the unknowable, the unanswerable questions about the world. There is something spiritual about it, something religious, and if you're looking for a book to maybe reawaken a sense of awe and wonder that you are looking for in a book about magic, this would be one I would recommend. And then the last book I'm going to recommend is the sort of most traditional high fantasy that I'm going to recommend on this list. The one book that, you know, it takes place in a fantasy kingdom in a secondary world that's going to look and feel very familiar if you think you have a preconceived notion of what a fantasy world looks like. And that's The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold. And I'm recommending this as opposed to other high or epic fantasies for several reasons. First, because even though this is the first of a number of books set in this world, it functions perfectly well as a standalone. You know what I said about standalones earlier and how fantasy doesn't always have to be daunting series. But the other reason I'm recommending this is because Bujold's writing is actually very character-driven. You will learn about the magic system, you will learn about the politics, and you will do it because you care about the people. And this isn't like a massive sprawling cast of characters with like a bunch of different POVs like you'll get in some big epic fantasies. I think this is very manageable. And furthermore, although I did say that this works as a standalone, there are more books in this world that you can go read if you are so inclined. So as opposed to the previous two books I mentioned, which are from authors who are not particularly prolific, there is a lot of Bujold you can read if you decide you like her. I have been meaning to continue on with the books set in this world ever since I read this, and I have not done that yet. I've also been meaning to continue on with her sci-fi series, the Vorkosigan Saga, ever since I read Cordelia's Honor, which is a 2-book bind-up. But if you're looking to get into sci-fi as well, I think that's a good place to start for sci-fi for some of the same reasons, because the world building is strong but accessible because her writing is so character driven. And she has just such a massive backlist in both genres that you can explore should you so desire. So those three ended up having this really lovely color scheme that I did not plan at all. It just turned out that way. And I just want to take a moment to hold them up so you can appreciate the lovely color scheme. And then the 10th and final question, we finally made it to the end. Who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? So as I sort of hinted at earlier, I've kind of totally stopped subscribing to new people because I'm kind of overwhelmed with the book recs and trying to get less overwhelmed with them. I'm not actively looking for more content creators to recommend me more things. I am, however, continuing to meet people in the community, especially like through mutual friends. So the last person I subscribed to was someone I sort of already knew about for a long time and kind of didn't realize I wasn't already subscribed, but she totally deserves the shout out. I'm going to shout out Diana from the channel Bookish Die. I've known who she is for quite a while because of mutual friends and because she's in the Stitchin' Bitch group that does live shows every month. And because I've watched those live shows with those mutual friends, I sort of felt like I knew who she was. I sort of felt like I was watching her booktube content to the point where I didn't realize that I wasn't actually subscribed to her and wasn't actually following her booktube content. I fixed that. I think you will like Di's channel if you are looking for thoughtful, in-depth thoughts and wrap-ups on a lot of SFF books, and she deserves way more subscribers than she has right now. So that is it. That is the end of the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I hope you have gotten to know me as a fantasy reader. That was the goal. Maybe you found me through this tag. If so, I hope you consider subscribing. It's been fun to make. I don't think I'm going to tag anyone because this is an older tag and I really don't know who's done it and who hasn't. But if, like me, you thought about doing it last year and then just like didn't, maybe consider this as a little extra push. Anyhow, please leave me a comment if you want to contribute to any of the topics of discussion that the questions of this tag brought up for me. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.